Today we are going to talk about the power of language. As you may know, reading, writing, listening, and speaking are integral for our everyday life, since language is the primary tool for expression and communication. Linguists and scholars argue that language is a cultural and social phenomenon. It affects our culture as much as our culture influences it. And it is a social phenomenon because language exists only in society, and also because it's a means of nourishing, promoting, developing our culture, and establishing human relationships. Have you ever thought about how powerful language might be? Or which types of behavior may it influence? Or maybe if the change to a better society should start in our language. Well, that's an issue. Discrimination is a very important problem that affects all over the world. And it has a strong relationship with the language because we can promote it depending on the choice of our words, or which is most important, is the fact that language might be part of the solution. In this video, we are going to discuss different types of discrimination and which is the role of language to encourage a more inclusive and fair society. Well, as we said before, language is cultural, so it has to do with cultural roles which are appropriate for men and women. However, the degree to which these sex differences are lexicalized is different in every language. For example, the word casting in English is used for male and females, but it is not the case in French, for example, which they use casting for males and cuisine for females. Something very similar happens with professional occupations. For example, in English, we have the distinction between actor and actress, waiter and waitress. In Italian, for example, the word avvocato refers to a female or a male lawyer. And although the word avvocata exists, it is used in more informal context and it doesn't appear on the diploma. So this has to do with the fact that usually, well, generally, social changes precede linguistic changes. Have you ever thought why do we use different words to describe men and women? Or why do we say that a man is self-confident while a woman is bossy? Maybe why do we expect women to speak more correct, in a more correct way than men? Well, all this has to do with the same problem, cultural stereotypes. And we can continue to use language to reinforce them, or we can use it as a tool for change. Something similar happens with the sex mark pronouns. And why should we think about a binary distinction between male and female? Here is when we need to consider the concept of gender identity. We cannot assume how people identify their gender based on their appearance, because this practice may result in many individuals being misgendered, and of course, this will make them feel disrespected, marginalized, or even invisible. And this is the reason why I think it's interesting to consider the use of different pronouns. For example, in the LGBT community, they use the pronoun ze instead of using he or she. And also they use the non-gender specific pronoun here instead of him or her. And if not, I think it also may be a good idea to ask somebody how they would like to be referred to in order to be more respectful and inclusive to everyone. A similar situation occurs when this linguistic differentiation is made because of race or ethnic groups.
When I'm working with most teachers is for us to really pay attention to the way that we police language in our society. A lot of times the way that we ask students to not use or use languages is really related to the policing of their identities in ways that's really problematic. So for example, people often invite students of color, students who speak a second language to code switch. And the idea is that you can speak one way in one place and another way in another place because there are different ways to speak appropriately. But at the end of the day, there are scholars for decades now who've troubled up the issue, right? I'm not saying anything new, who've troubled up the issue and says, well, what does it mean when you teach a young person that speaking in school in a way that's different from the way that they speak at home is the appropriate way? They internalize the idea that the way that they speak at home is not intellectual, that the way that they speak at home is not appropriate for certain settings. And the question is why?
Why? This is an intriguing question. Why do we have to speak in a certain way when we are in an interview? Why do we have to use a certain language to sound smart? And when we start digging on into these questions, um, this takes us to a root which is full of ideas of racism, colonialism, and imperialism. And we have to be very careful because these ideas are really dangerous. We need to be careful in the way we communicate each other and to students because we cannot teach in a way that implies that certain languages, dialects, and thus identities are not welcomed in the classroom. If we think about the speakers of pidgin languages, for example, they are subject of discrimination because several people think that these languages are corrupt, anti-based forms of a normal language that they come from. And of course, we know that this is not the case. I mean, a pidgin language derives from one language or languages of those who use it, but through processes of simplification, reduction, interference, or mixture, especially as regards what is pronunciation. But this doesn't mean that they are inferior than the language they come from. Let's take as an example the Nigerian Pidgin English, which originated as a lingua franca for trade purposes amongst the Nigerians and the Portuguese merchants during the 17th century. After the departure of the missionaries, this lingua franca did not go with them, but remained. Although Nigerian Pidgin English is highly spoken in Nigeria by every individual starting from an early age, it is regarded as a bastardization of the English language used by non-literates, and it is used in informal situations while English is used for official purposes and the medium of education. Here again, we have this ironic stigma because Nigerian Pidgin English is the most widely spoken language and the only unbiased lingua franca with interjections of many indigenous languages across the country, and yet it is the most scorned language. But luckily, this situation may soon change because some people and some non-governmental organizations have set in motion some raising awareness campaigns that aim at entrenching the dignity of this popular but stigmatized language. Well, this situation that Nigerian Pidgin English suffers has to do with the fact that standard languages are given this privilege, and this is because they are imposed by a powerful minority, but they are not representative of the whole population. A clear example of this, as regards pronunciation, is the RP, the received pronunciation, which is the standard for the pronunciation of English as a second language and as a foreign language as well. Um, it is estimated that this standard is spoken by the 3% of the population. The thing is that this is considered an educated speech. The same happens with the General American, and in this case, this is a standard model for pronunciation of English as a second language in Asia and Latin America, and this is due to the political, economic, educational, and scientific dominance that the USA has.
But what about Scottish English, Caribbean English, Jamaican, Estuary, Irish, Cockney English, and all the other varieties that we may find?
Well, this issue of standard languages and accents makes us think about our own perception of the English language and help us to reflect upon the reason why we are teaching English. I mean, what for? Which is the role of English in our classroom? And which approach are we following? Because for a long time, English has been taught as a foreign language, assuming that learners seek the competence to communicate with a native speaker or speakers from the inner circle.
Just to clarify, the speakers from the inner circle use English as their native language, their mother tongue. It's the language they learned in their infancy and the main language for communication there. This is the case, for example, of the UK and the USA. But in the case of the outer circle, English served as a second language, that is, the language of administration, the one that the British Empire used to teach to local people as a kind of civilizing force. This is the case, for example, of India. And then in the case of the expanding circle, English is used as an useful tool because even though it has been imposed by a colonizing power, they have chosen to use English as a kind of official language. And this is why we have so much variety and all these new Englishes that had risen.
With this in mind, the goal for English pronunciation teaching has been to achieve the native accent. However, in reality, learners use English to communicate with speakers from the expanded circle rather than with native speakers. So, if we think of English as a lingua franca, that is a common language for speakers whose mother tongue is different, well, in this case, it does not exclude native speakers, but they have to respect the norms of the ELF setting instead of expecting the ELF community to adapt to their own norms.
In other words, English as a lingua franca is the way in which English is currently used by the majority of people who don't have it as a mother tongue. In multilingual contexts, it's not a variety of English, but a different paradigm from EFL and ESL because it is based on different assumptions and beliefs about the English language.
So, to sum up, there are some big differences between teaching EFL, English as a foreign language, and teaching ELF, English as a lingua franca. If I could summarize them in sort of one sentence, the main difference is that the native speaker or those perceived as native speakers are no longer at the center. The language is no longer seen as the only default standard that all students should aspire to imitate. But on the other hand, what's emphasized is the global nature of the English language and the fact that most people who use it are non-native speakers. As a result, the language that we want to help our students use should be language that is easy to understand in international context.
There has been some research about the priorities of pronunciation in the use of English as a lingua franca, and this takes us to Jenkins' Lingua Franca Core. Rather than being a limitation, it has been considered a basic principle for language teaching.
The Lingua Franca Core recognizes 4 essential areas that need to be considered for mutual intelligibility. Intelligibility, according to Robin Walker, is the basic recognition of words and utterances in the flow of speech, basically being understood. And the 4 areas that we need to consider are consonant sounds, consonant clusters, vowel length, and also the placement of the nuclear stress.
One of these areas of importance is consonant sounds. And these are fundamental because sometimes non-native speakers have a tendency to replace sounds that are not present in the RL1 with sounds that they are and that they think that sound the same. A very common mistake is replacing the sound with the sound that would be, they would say free instead of three. Something similar happens with consonant clusters. In this case, they are not so common to all languages. That's why non-native speakers tend to delete one consonant from the cluster. And this would not affect intelligibility unless it is the initial consonant of the cluster. Then, as regards vowels, that is pure vowels and diphthongs, there is again a tendency to shorten the diphthongs and reduce them to pure vowels, which would confuse the listener, certainly. And the last area of importance is the placement of the nuclear stress. This is not the same as sentence stress, because this has to do with the most important stress in a short utterance. And sentence stress is related to all the stress syllables that we can find in a sentence. Well, to round off this video, I would like you to listen to Hernan Diaz, the Associate Director of the Hispanic Institute at Columbia University, that has something really interesting to say.
Does my accent need correcting? I don't think so. To sound like who exactly? A native speaker? What would that even mean? Looking at accent reduction classes online, the third hit I got was not aimed at Eastern European or South American immigrants. It actually read, "Want to get rid of your New York accent?" An accent can be a stigma, even within native speakers of the same language. These variations, determined by geography, class, and race, are always identified with stereotypes, and fleeing from one means embracing another. In England, a Russian writer may adopt an upper-crust British accent. In California, a Texan actor may aspire to a San Fernando Valley cadence. Even though everybody has an accent, there certainly is such a thing as accent discrimination. Most of us have either suffered or witnessed it at some point. I can easily tell when I'm not being understood or when someone is underscoring a difference in pronunciation just to show me my place. Because accent discrimination is, in the end, all about place. Who belongs and who doesn't.
Accents are a reminder that language doesn't belong to anyone, even to its native speakers. Language is shared, and it's a space where everyone is welcomed and cooperates towards mutual comprehension. Well, thanks for being here.